If that's up, I'm going to give two short presentations, each about 20 minutes within the hour, and there's going to be a slot for Q&A at the end of each one. The first presentation is going to be about the foundational economy in general, foundational economy thinking and doing. And the second presentation is going to be about a specific thing, which is SMEs in the Welsh food system. So let's start the business. I'm going to talk in three sections. First of all, I'm going to introduce the core ideas about thinking foundational, about multiple economies, how this overlaps with COVID-19 and what we've learned from that, and the whole questions about what does good look like in the foundational economy. Then I'm going to give you an outline history of more than 100 years and talk about how the foundational economy was built after 1880, degraded after 1980 by privatization, outsourcing and the rest. And now we've got the challenge of building new systems within planetary limits. And then I'm going to talk finally about doing foundational in Wales. So let's start with the basics about thinking foundational and how foundational economy is the well-being critical half of the economy. Now, the basic idea here is that you stop thinking about the economy and think about economies in the plural. And we've got them listed on the right-hand side of the slide. And when people talk about the economy, or very often they talk about the tradable, competitive, high-tech economy, wheels and wings. But that kind of economy is only about 35% of the Welsh economy by output and employment. And it's been in trouble at least since the 1970s in Wales. So let's think about the rest of the economy, the overlooked economy, the haircuts, the sofas, the holidays, the things that make life nice. All of us have sofas at home, even though we don't think about them. And then I think below there, the foundational economy, which is the daily essentials, the providential services like health, education and care, and the material infrastructure like the pipe and cable utilities and food distribution. And last but not least, because all the 1, 2 and 3 are about basically market or taxes or things that are done for money, there's the core economy of family and community, because we shouldn't forget that if you look at care, for example, some of it is in the market area as adult care or whatever, but a large part of it is done within families and for free. Now, what we did was to focus on the importance of this neglected foundational economy, which was provided daily essentials. And in a way, that's all been vindicated by COVID-19. Because if you're a bit confused about what Karel means by the foundational economy, it is, of course, the key workers of the economy. And COVID-19 has reminded us that what we depend on isn't investment bankers, but ordinary workers doing their jobs in harm's way on the supermarket till or the residential home, and work which is often, as we know, gendered and unpaid. And it's really interesting to see that if you actually look at the economy in the UK, in London, or in Wales, then you see that these foundational sectors are very important indeed. In Wales, for example, the material stuff, pipe and cable utilities and food distribution employs 14% of the workforce. The providential stuff, which is basically health, education and care, is 35% of the workforce. The overlooked economy, which I suppose is mainly restaurants, takeaways, barbers, things of that sort, 21%, and the tradable sector, no more than 30%. If you compare it with London, of course, the main difference of London is it has a much larger tradable competitive sector, as does the UK. Now, we've spent a lot of time in Wales trying to revive the tradable and competitive sector. And the question we've said is, well, that hasn't worked so brilliantly. So why don't we try managing the economy that we've got? That in this foundational economy of material and providential, we've got half the Welsh workers, and it's a really mixed bag. For example, social care is low pay, low productivity, whereas health and education are much more favourable in terms of their social and economic characteristics. And if you start thinking, therefore, about this half of the economy, which is foundational, you're left with a question about what does good look like in the foundational economy. And, you know, traditionally that's answered by saying, well, it's per capita GVA or GDP, per capita national income and output. But in the foundational economy, it's altogether more complicated. And we've worked on measures of residual household income, which is household income not just after taxes and deductions, but also after housing, transport and utility bills. And I've got quite a nice example for you on the right-hand side, which compares the outright owner in Wales with a kind of terrace house, relatively low gross income of 33k, private renters in London, and in a household basis, nearly 20k a year more. If you look at disposable post-tax income, of course, the private renter in London has more disposable income. But if you take off housing and transport in London, then the private renter has a lower residual income. And if you remember that private renters in London increasingly are people with kids and young families, then the per capita residual income is almost half that in the London private renter. And so we've been interested in new kinds of measures. We're also interested in livability. A couple of years back, we did a survey in Morriston where, you know, the policymakers want to deliver transport infrastructure, and what Morriston citizens want is better social infrastructure, parks, libraries, and activities like youth clubs. So thinking about the foundational economy gives you an important part of the economy, half of it in employment and output, and it forces you to think in an innovative way about what does good look like. Let's turn now to the history and old and new reliance systems. And well, there we've got the, you know, the FE is about systems. It's about technology. And you see there the British lattice pylon, which won a competition in 1927. And at present, we have 70,000 of those pylons, only to the one design, which essentially take electricity from the wind farm or the generating station to your locality on a high voltage line before it's stepped down with a transformer. And the FE is technology. And if you think about the technology, it's in systems, which we call reliance systems, which deliver an intermediate good or service which addresses social needs. And the intermediate service might be clean water, the service might be healthcare. Nobody, of course, actually wants water or healthcare. They are intermediate in that they allow you to get on with the life that you want to live. And the key thing here is 1880 to 1950, essentially big cities, urban life ceases to be a killer, courtesy of piped water and sewerage, long chain food production and distribution, public transport, universal education, health, adding 20 years to urban life expectancy and creating huge new economic sectors like health services. The NHS in Wales is the leading sector of the economy in terms of weight. It employs 100,000. So this whole kind of industrial period, which ends with free hospitalisation and the NHS in the 1940s. And then I think, let me move on a slide. You have this business that after 1979, after 1980, you have processes of financialization, which is corporate and fund players coming in, claiming high returns, paying no tax, recognizing no social duties, and you've got the state retreating via privatization and outsourcing, which of course hands it over to these players. And on the right-hand side, from some work we did 5 years ago, there's the corporate structure, which was being used by terra firma private equity to run the Four Seasons healthcare chain, where you've got, I think it's about 13 or 15 levels of company for 300 odd homes, and it goes via Jersey, Guernsey, Bermuda, all the rest of that kind of stuff, of course, for tax avoidance reasons. And whereas in the 19th century, on the last slide, the railway companies were lucky to get just under 5%, PLC and fund investors are now seeking 10% plus returns. And so things have not been hugely successful. The achievements of 1880 to 1950s degraded after 1980, and now we have a new challenge, which is essentially what we call FE 2.0, which is to renew our foundational systems within planetary limits. Now, you shouldn't need telling if you're into a circular economy, but at the current level of consumption and production, mankind would require more than 2.5 planets, according to the Stockholm Institute. And interestingly, of course, food, transport and housing, key foundational provisions, account for more than half that footprint. So we live in a damaged planet and an unsustainable world, and what we want is renewal. And I think that involves two things. First of all, cleaning up the high carbon sectors like food, housing and transport. You know, you need housing decarbonisation and all the rest of it, and expanding low carbon services like health and care, because the person-to-person services, of course, have a very low carbon footprint. But we also need new systems like wood economy with productive forest for sequestration, and then the timber inputting to construction, displacing steel and cement. So in the first section, I told you the foundational economy, half our employment, absolutely critical. Everybody depends on foundational services. I've now given you a bit of history about the heroic construction before the 1950s, the privatization and outsourcing mess up, and now the challenge of rebuilding within planetary limits. Now I'll come finally to doing foundational in Wales. Wait a second. And I think at this point, we begin to see that although in a way, renewing systems, staying within planetary limits is in principle very clear and straightforward, it quickly gets muddled. And I think the muddle arises in Wales because political agency is splintered in lots of ways. There's nobody who can simply say, just do it. You've got multi-level government, with Welsh government having few tax and borrowing powers. You've got 22 local authorities. You've got corporatized not-for-profits like further education colleges and housing associations, and you've got 7 health boards. And one of the big problems we've faced is, how do you get any kind of coherent action in this splintered system. And the way we've been trying to think about this is new ways of working, which are about alliances for change. Building the road through as we go, often through prefigurative experiment and institutional stretch. And I'll give you 3 examples. We've recently done work on town centres and on wood economy, and the Climate Change Ministry has recently had deep dives on both of those. And what you do in, like on wood economy and afforestation, where Wales has failed to meet its planting targets for the past 20 years, is you lock up the trade body Confederation of Forest Industries, Wood Knowledge Wales, which is a green pressure group, Natural Resources Wales, which owns the tree planting experimenters and community groups, and you lock them up 2 hours at a time, twice a week, until after about a month, you've got some movement on what to do about tree planting and timber into construction. That's an interesting example of alliances for change built at the initiative of government. Another thing is simply to bridge our differences. In north of Wales, we've got Cwmni Bro in Blaenau Ffestiniog, which has created 150 jobs in a social enterprise network, which is an amazing achievement, but has traditionally, I think, been seen by Gwynedd Council a bit like the Americans thought of the Viet Cong in Vietnam, you know, as a bunch of people who materialize, raid, and then retreat up the valley. And what's happening there, I think, is increasing understanding that Gwynedd and Cwmni Bro can work together on their objectives. Quite interestingly here, the Wales Co-op Centre last year actually produced a report which said it wasn't seeking cooperative firms in social care, which is of course in Wales dominated by small mom and pop firms doing adult care for the old, etc. What it wanted was not cooperative firms, but cooperative values in care, which mom and pop firms could actually produce. And then you've got to think about participation with citizens' assemblies to deal with complex issues, where the classic example would be the Blaenau Gwent Climate Assembly, where 4 housing associations and the poorest local authority in Wales came together to actually bring together a representative group of people to talk about what should be done about climate change. So I think as soon as you move from thinking about foundational to doing foundational, you've got to think not simply about directing people, but enabling people and building alliances. Then I think the second thing is really experiment, innovation. I think if you want to be social scientific, you could call it prefigurative experiment, experiment which leads to something else. It's quite often the case that political agency is splintered and we don't know what will work. No, everybody is unhappy about the present system of social care in Wales, but you know, nobody wants to impose a grand blueprint. So learning through experiment is very important. And this then, I think, has an important role in it, that it provides a performative demonstration. The idea of performative demonstration is quite simply, people often aren't convinced by rational argument, but they are convinced by show and tell. If you can show people doing something better about adult care, as they are doing with home care in Gwynedd at present. And as part of this, in 2019-20, the Welsh Government experimented with a challenge fund. And I think this was important because for the first time, Welsh Government admitted it didn't know what to do, and it funded 50 experiments for 100k each across a whole series of areas, from trying to get people to eat more shellfish in Wales to the obvious stuff about home care for adults and all the rest of that kind of stuff, with communities of practice afterwards for networking and scaling. And I think Wales is now a hive, a hub of experiments in reforming home care, organising housing retrofit, using public procurement strategically. And I think what we're discovering is none of this is easy. It's all very well to talk about alliances for change and experiment, but really a lot of it is about the people that I call really rather with affection, the charismatic nutters, the people who have a vision, who are usually up against conservative organizations which want to default onto what's easy, not what gives the leverage, organizations which want to avoid conflict. I mean, it's actually quite interesting if you look at NHS Wales. You've got 7 health boards, and all of them are presently doing procurement with a 15% weighting for social value, which the government approves of. Only 1 board in Wales is doing local staff recruitment and development and taking on people who have failed at school and developing them into registered nurses over 8 or 10 years. And that's when wages are actually, they're not 40, they're 70% of costs in NHS Wales. You know, organizations do what's easy, what gets them political credit. And you can see this all along. When you look at town centre policies, everybody wants to do things like cut business rates for town centre businesses. They don't want to press edge of town parking charges in the retail parks. So we need communities of practice to network the change makers and build shared radical agendas. And it's important, I think, here that the Challenge Fund experimenters continue as a community of practice. So as soon as you start to do foundational, you discover you're in a messy, conflictual world. And we need alliances, we need communities of practice to make some progress, which is difficult. And that's the end of the presentation on 20 minutes. I'll now take questions. Shall I try to stop sharing? Stop presenting. There we are. Stop presenting. Okay. Gary said he wanted me to talk very briefly at the end of the presentation about how this fits with circular economy and circular thinking. And I think it's 2 cheers, because there are 2 areas of overlap which are very strong, and there's 1 area of difference, really. The areas of overlap are, first of all, the importance of, as we say, working within planetary limits, as circular economy people would say, limiting waste and recycling, and all the stuff about distinguishing between biological and technical materials and all the rest of that. You know, that's all kind of common. And the business, therefore, of circular economy and the business of foundational economy overlap on this business of reducing waste, which involves, amongst other things, replumbing material flows in our society. Okay, great, agreement there. Second area of agreement and overlap is about communities of practice, experiment, all the rest of that kind of business. We've been committed to this from the beginning, and it's really great to see that communities of practice is thinking about inter-organizational communities of practice, because that's what we need, and that's what we're trying to build up in. We run a thing called FE Network Wales, if anybody is interested, and at present what we're trying to do there is to build up round tables in adult care, housing, health, maybe in food and other areas, so that we could actually have ongoing communities of practice. So within planetary limits, by replumbing material flows, great. Communities of practice were agreed on process. The area, I think, of difference is the circular economy is very much a technical approach to projects, whereas I think the foundational economy stuff is often about navigating complex multi-level systems where there's lots of different interests who want different things, and to some extent you can't even choose your project definition. At present, for example, my research team is mainly working on tax and benefit and how that changes incentives to work in the northeast of England, and on NHS and workforce development schemes in Wales. And this is because, you know, clearly the social stuff of workforce participation and how we develop our workforce and bring on people is very important, and it's a very complicated world. So the third thing is this idea that the circular economy is about nice projects. The foundational economy is about managing in a complex socio-political world, which is what the second presentation about food is actually about. Now, questions, complaints, or whatever, we've got 5 minutes or so in which to do those.
If there's nobody going to dive in, I'd like to ask a question, if I may, Karel. And I really love your phrase, by the way, but before I ask the question, of charismatic nutters. We definitely welcome any and all charismatic nutters into the CAPE programme, because we're very much, as you know, trying to firstly kick off communities of practice, but then obviously encourage those communities of practice to change. And I think I've met a couple of charismatic nutters on the CAPE programme thus far. You know, it's easy to see somebody that looks very much like you. So I'd just like to put that in. But very briefly, because I can see some other hands have gone up. In terms of the experimentation element and of communities coming together, what kind of time frame do you see that that can take, particularly when you've got diverse organisations working together for community type projects?
Yeah, I think this is very difficult, very uneven. It's much easier to do top down in a rather ineffectual, non-participatory way, which is what Welsh Government has been doing with the Future Generations Act and all the rest of it, than to actually involve people. And I think it's only in a couple of areas of Wales do we actually have the level of coherent community organisation at an economic and social level, which means we can build relatively rapidly. The example I would give is Blaenau Ffestiniog. If we could get many other areas in Wales to the level of Blaenau Ffestiniog, we could move rapidly on participation. As it is, what we're going to have to do is experiment with institutions like citizens' assemblies.
Which is obviously something they've done in Scotland. I can see some other hands up. What I would like to do afterwards is get a name from you at Blaenau Ffestiniog, because we'd like to invite them in to talk to some of our communities of practice. Desiree, I can see your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Hi, Desiree. Yes, we've met before, haven't we? Yeah.
You're on mute, Desiree. Sorry, you're still on mute.
Mute button, the dreaded mute button. Hi, Professor Williams. Lovely to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you, Desiree.
Yeah, you're probably not surprised that I'm going to ask a question, as you know my nature by now. So I really thought that was really interesting, obviously in the future economy. But what I would like to ask directly is some thoughts on the process of change, because what you've just given us is a really good historical overview. You've talked about visionary people. In my opinion, for what it's worth, quite often those visionary people are not at the level, the strategic level, to encourage change or to gain that momentum for change. So that voice is often not heard. So I loved your idea of show and tell. I loved the fact that you've mentioned hierarchical, historical ways of working, the top-down approach. But obviously, I'd like your ideas, please, Professor Williams, on how we manage and change that aspect, because the visionaries are not at strategic level. Some are, of course. Let's not denigrate anybody, but in general, it's at the workforce level. How do we change?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer to that question, Desiree. I think you're absolutely right. I said charismatic nutters with real affection. Do you understand?
Thank you.
I mean, yeah. There are lots of visionaries, but we also have lots of organizations with lots of inertia in them. And, if you've actually ever worked in a large organization, like the University of Manchester, for example, you will see how it divides into a whole series of silos and corridors, who mainly, Desiree, want to carry on doing what they're already doing, or at least not have a lot of what the Welsh would call diflastod and unpleasantness and conflict, which often comes with change. I think as to, how you move beyond this, what I would say is people have to understand that things aren't working as they are. And that means you then get disruptive elements in strategic positions. I think, for example, one of the most encouraging things at present is that the First Minister has put Julie James and Lee Waters, his two #1 troublemakers who are not frightened of conflict, into a climate change ministry to shake up policy on town centres, afforestation, housing, etc. But I think, the beginning of wisdom is the realization we've been pedaling in the wrong direction, standard policies aren't working, and therefore disruptors need to be given their head in strategic positions.
Thank you.
I suppose I briefly add to that and suggest that the more disruptors can come together, develop solutions to existing problems, as we're trying to support people doing cake, the more likely they are to succeed.
Absolutely. I mean, things don't just happen, Gary. They happen under pressure. And I mean, a community of practice should be able to say, A, the emperor has no clothes, and B, look at the nice little outfits we've run up.
Excellent point. Thank you. Right. And I think just a quick point from Gerald, who makes the point that housing associations often compete with each other because of the systems that are in place in terms of the funding.
Absolutely, and what might also think about tendering in social care and all the rest of that. Stupid behaviours are often not caused by people being unimaginative and stupid, but by the processes in which they are trapped. Now we need to move on to the next presentation, don't we?
Yes, please. Thanks for the questions. By all means, do drop them in the chat, and I'll pick them up. And obviously, when we get to the end of Karel's current presentation, we'll have a Q&A as well.
Right, now let's see. Right, okay, right, let's see. Okay, now let's see whether we can get this one up. The machine is very slow this morning. It's like me. Needs another cup of coffee. Right. Now, I'm going to talk about this because it's a report that we did for Welsh Government relatively recently. It's up on the foundationaleconomy.com website, foundationaleconomy, all one word, .com website. And I think it's a good illustration of the complexities of the world and how, you know, you're trying to pick your way through a whole series of problems. And the beginning point is the Welsh economy has a problem about the missing middle. It needs to grow the SME sector. And convinced of that, Welsh Government said to us, food and drink would be a good starting point. And then we did some research which showed the number of food and drink SMEs is not increasing, and some more research which suggested that the preoccupation with local demand couldn't generate the volume. So how would we think about reframing the problem? So I'm going to take you through this, which is, in a sense, it's about a kind of intellectual puzzle and an unresolved policy problem. First of all, let's talk about the missing middle. Now, this gives you the whole stock of Welsh firms. You've got the micro firms there, who account for 35% of employment. You've got the large firms with 38%. And in the middle, you've got the small at 15 and the medium at 12. Now, the interesting thing is the small and medium share of output and employment hasn't increased over the last 20 years, whereas the large firm share has declined by 6% and the micro firm share gone up by 4 or 5%. Now, you might say, why does this matter, Karel? And it matters because, broadly speaking, the large firms have well above average productivity, i.e. their share of turnover is much larger than their share of employment. The SMEs are on the button in terms of share of employment and turnover, but the micro firms have 35% of employment and 13% of turnover. They have a limited capacity to win the sales, to provide the earnings for the owner and any staff. And on the whole, Welsh micro firms on average employ just 1.6. So it's really typically a craftsman and a helper. Now, there's nothing in circular economy which would tell you about this problem, but this problem has concerned us in foundational economy thinking about Wales for a long time. And then the government caught up with us because food and drink is a foundational sector. The UK has more turnover in food and drink than it has in aerospace and automotive combined. The government is thinking, and this comes back to realizing things don't work, that inward investment is pouring water into a leaky bucket because companies leave as well as come. And so why don't we get more grounded SMEs in in Welsh food and drink. And that led us to some research, because when we started to look at it, we couldn't figure out whether the number of SMEs in food and drink was increasing or decreasing. However, we have some friends at the ONS in Newport, and they ran a special time series for us, which produced very interesting results, which is there you have the SMEs, 65 and 65 in 2010 and 2020, and the 50 to 249s, 35 to 40. So it's 100 to 105 over 10 years in the small and medium brackets, and that seems to be mainly nudge as firms grow very gently. That's why the 50 to 249 one increases, whereas there's been a very large increase in the number of micro firms in food and drink, with almost all the increase in drink, incidentally, around microbreweries. And by implication, because the micro firms are increasing, but the SMEs are not, you've got very little upward migration from micro to SME over 10 years. Now, that was actually something that we found out for the first time. The next slide shows you something which everybody knows, which is the supermarkets and the food service distributors for restaurants and takeaways are the gateway to volume demand. The average UK household spends more than £50 a week on food and non-alcoholic drinks, and more than £30 a week on restaurants and takeaways. I'm always struck by that point about the high spend on restaurants and takeaways, because my grandmother would not have improved. And so the Welsh population of just over 3 million has an annual household food spend there of 3.8 billion, and a restaurant and cafe meals 2.2 billion. It's a massive market in food and drink. But, and this is the point, you then look at the 100 or so SMEs we've got, and what you see is the paradox that these are very capable firms, but they actually have very slim profit margins. And this is true of Radnor Hills, Carnarvon Creameries, Hilltop Honey and Puffin, all of which are great little SME firms. And, you know, the issue there is that there have two problems. One, they've all got a high purchase to sales, apart from Radnor Hills at least. And they also are in a power relation with much larger supermarkets and food service distributors, the supermarkets supplying the households, the food service distributors, the restaurants. And what we found when we interviewed the managers was they could negotiate fast-moving markets, they had productive market and financial skills, because that was the precondition of getting onto and staying on a supermarket list. But the margins in terms of profit were very slim indeed. So we had this problem about the number missing middle. We showed that there was a problem about micros increasing but SMEs not. We have this issue about the gatekeepers, and the result is that the margins of profit are very narrow for very competent firms. So what we then tried to do was to say, if those are the problems, the issues, how do you pivot policy? And I think the first observation was rather difficult, because Welsh Government and local authorities have put a lot of effort into local food and public sector purchasing. And the fundamental problem here is that public sector food purchasing is too small in the aggregate to sustain a big cohort of successful food and drink SMEs. That if you look at firms like Radnor Hills or South Carnarvon or Puffin, they've typically got 25 to 65 million of turnover. If you look at all of Welsh public spending on food, drink and catering by local authorities, by health boards and all the rest, it's just over 90 million in a straightforward year like 2019. And the way we dramatize that is that the turnover at one Tesco superstore in Culverhouse Cross at Cardiff, excluding petrol, is roughly equal to the whole of Welsh public sector demand for food. The other problem is that the Welsh food system runs with a very high level of imports and exports because climate and topography have resulted on a narrow output specialisation on meat and dairy. Just 5% of the red meat produced in Wales is consumed in Wales. So however many school dinners or hospital lunches we actually get with Welsh lamb on the plate, it's not going to make much difference to the hill farmers in Rhyadr and mid Wales. And the other problem, of course, is Welsh households demand a diversified non-seasonal diet. I mean, this morning, for example, I had some out-of-season raspberries from Portugal for my breakfast. Reasonably responsible, not air freighted from Peru, but nevertheless, part of this, demand for, salad and tomatoes, for example, out of season. This means that, if you look at the Welsh food system in the aggregate, there's a huge volume of meat and dairy products moving across Offa's-Dyke to be consumed outside Wales, and Welsh households are demanding a diversified non-seasonal diet. The kind of cowl of root vegetables and mutton in winter, which my grandmother lived on before 1914 on a farm in Carmarthenshire, just wouldn't be acceptable now. So what do you do? Well, the first thing we suggested was to tackle the gatekeepers, the supermarkets and the food service distributors. And that's very difficult, because Tesco, for example, has just one buyer in Wales buying Welsh lines, whereas Tesco in Scotland or Northern Ireland has a team of them. And this is a lot about how the supermarkets see Wales as a region, not a nation. And the one positive point here is that when you think of food service distribution, it's not just Break Brothers and the big conglomerates. All the supermarkets are basically headquartered outside Wales, and they're now under pressure from Aldi and Lidl, hard discounters on price, and being taken over by private equity, which is what's happened to Morrison's and to Asda. But there is a bright point. The restaurants and the takeaways are met by food service distributors, and there we have two family-owned SME players, Castell Howell in the south and Hadlech Food Service in the north. And what we suggested was something for something contracts, whereby people like the NHS actually said to Castell Howell, you've got millions of turnover tied up with our business, why don't you stock more Welsh lines? We'll give you a longer contract or soften it a bit on price if you're prepared to stock more Welsh lines. So that was the first suggestion, that you needed to tackle the gatekeepers, so to speak. The second issue was how to fund expansion. what we found out when we looked at the firm was that secured bank lending is problematic across most of Wales, certainly west of Bridgend, when property values are so low. Puffin Foods had invested 14 million in plant and buildings, but when it came to be valued for the next bank loan to fund expansion for the supermarkets, the bank said 4 million is what your plant and buildings are worth, and therefore they were only prepared to lend X% of that. Now, there are various people offering equity finance like venture capital or private equity, but that involves losing control of the firm, which doesn't appeal to the families who own SMEs in food in Wales. And the answer that we suggested was not finance, but more state promoted infrastructure on the model of the Crosshands successful Crosshands Food Park, or the Haverfordwest Food Park, which is Crosshands is site and buildings, Haverfordwest is serviced sites, plus there are 3 centres in food innovation in Wales, which are important in developing the technology for new products, which is, I think, pretty crucial for SMEs, because Wales has too many producers of yoghurt and such like, and actually getting Castell Howell to stock another 3 lines of Welsh yoghurt will simply cannibalise sales from Llaeth y Llan and firms of that sort. If the rents were right, SMEs could expand and focus on their operating business with rented buildings. Now, this was quite interesting because, you know, Welsh government had given us this problem in a sense of getting more SMEs because they were convinced about the missing middle. They'd licensed us to do this research, which showed there was a problem about micros increasing, but SMEs not. And then we come back and tell them that, you know, the local food thing is much more complicated than you suppose, and we need to have political conversations with Castell Howell and Harlech and start building more food parks. And I think it's fair to say that this actually, coming back to Desiree's point, was not entirely what the people in strategic control in the ag and food departments and economy departments of Welsh Government wanted to hear. Or it's not that they were hostile, but they were already doing a whole series of things. And many of these things actually were good things. They'd organised food and drink clusters, which were really communities of practice for SMEs. We've got 3 centres in Food Innovation Wales on technology for new products, the Food and Drink Industry Board in Wales. And, you know, they were doing all these things, and all these things were good things. But really, what we had to try and do, and haven't entirely succeeded so far, in persuading them that, yes, what your policies are good, but they haven't got us over the hump of increasing the number of SMEs. And so I think at that point, what we're left with is, and this is a messy world, is a whole series of conversations and asking for worked examples and trying to set deadlines that slip. I mean, because thinking foundational means you don't have the answer in your back pocket, and you've got to use the existing structures, the clusters of food and drink firms that the Ag and Food Department has organised, all the rest of that, to start conversations. And so we've been trying to encourage people to say, talk with the food service distributors, what needs to change so Castell Howell and Harlech would stock more Welsh lines? And can we make the numbers work on an expansion of food parks? On the bottom line picture there, you've got Ebbw Vale Steelworks as was, which now, of course, is a great big flattened site. And the question is, could we do a food park at Ebbw Vale like at Crosshands? And, you know, as part of all that, you know, as researchers, we try to set deadlines for meetings and everything slips and people get on with everyday business, but we keep on plugging away. So it's not exactly a heroic story, but it is, I think, an interesting story. And the foundational economy is about trying to apply analysis, thinking about the empirics, finding the levers, and then trying to persuade both the top and the bottom that things have to change in this direction. And at that point, I'm going to stop presenting. And all this is intended as an illustration of, you know, the complexities of the world as soon as you start researching systems and thinking about how to change them. Gary.
Thanks very much, Karel. I will ask people to put hands up or to type into the chat if they've got questions. As you point out, it is a complex area. Just, I suppose, a quick question from me, and then I'll go to Paul Jones, who's got a question. Firstly, in terms of UK and Wales level, is it time to introduce a carbon tax on food to encourage or even to support a movement back towards seasonal food consumption in the UK? Because obviously the carbon footprint of some of the food that comes in is not helping the planet at all, and obviously not supporting the UK economy. And at the bottom level, do you think community growing can provide some of that area in terms of encouraging people to eat more local produce?
Yeah. On carbon tax, intellectually, yes. Politically, not now. I think one of the really interesting things is the way in which the Brexiteers like Steve Baker in Parliament are revving themselves up for their next struggle against net zero and all things of that sort. And so I think we have to be reasonably careful about what we propose. You know, I try not to fly. You know, we have an elderly Toyota Prius in the driveway. That's all very well. But I think there's going to be a political struggle in this country, and we should be careful not to provoke opposition quickly. On local action, I'm all for it, but I think it needs to be connected upwards. We need to realize that shifting very small quantities of demand onto micro firms, which often don't make a proper living for the owner and the employee, is not a very sensible strategy. And the question then is, how do we bring on I'm all in favor of using local demand or public demand to get micro firms started, but we have to then think about how do we kind of get them onto the food park and onto some trajectory of expansion. And I know that micro firms do not exist to become SMEs for Karel, and that's a naive way of looking at it. But nevertheless, from a Welsh point of view, we need migration from micro to SME.
Thank you. Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Karel. That was really, really informative, and it reinforces a lot of my own research. You know, I've been doing research on artisan entrepreneurship behaviour, looking at town centres, and you know, you go to Neath, you go to Swansea town centre, and you see the devastation of the high street, and then the need for a seismic change in mentality about how we populate high streets, and to move to this concept of locality instead of, you could go to any high street in Wales and it would be difficult to know where you are, isn't it? Because they all look the same, they're all chains, etc. So how do we move to that sense of locality and give identity based on local produce? And I completely agree with what you're saying. It's just, the changes have been made in a step-by-step way, which probably haven't got the momentum, and you've mentioned the political infighting and agendas that are going on, which are delaying everything, isn't it? And it's, we're not moving quickly enough, and we haven't got enough emphasis on the supermarket dominance, as you've noted. It's incredibly difficult to break that supply chain cycle, isn't it? So but many thanks for your talk. It was really, really excellent in its focus.
Yeah, I could recommend what a report by ourselves called Small Towns, Big Issues, which the Welsh government published, heroically published, in that it basically said we'd been peddling in the wrong direction for the past 40 years. And in places like Bangor, Haverfordwest, Bridgend, which are the 3 towns we looked at, we've had a huge development of what we call edge town, off roundabout housing estates, retail parks, business parks, etc., which all tied in with automobility, car dependence. And clearly we need to figure out ways of renewing our high streets. And that's a long journey which we're only just starting out on, Paul. I mean, you're very right on that one, though it needs to be said. Lee Waters is jumping up and down on that one and is trying to get some action. And, things do change. When we started out on the Small Towns, Big Issues report, nobody was really prepared to be brave about edge towns. I was in a meeting last week with the chief Welsh planner, and he accepted the analysis and said we need to have clampdowns on edge of town new development to actually help revitalise the town centre. That's it's not going to revitalise the town centre, Paul, but in terms of people changing their attitudes and their mentalities.
Yes, absolutely agree.
I mean, I do believe we're on a journey, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely.
With all these things, we're on a journey. And the question is, how do we form alliances, communities of practice, and move faster? And stop saying X is top or Y is evil, and work out how we can work together.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Many thanks.
That's okay.
Any other thoughts or questions? We've got a minute of Karel's time, so please do use it. Neges or Claire Fagel and the Alfred Just Ben. Any other questions, thoughts before we go? I can see a hand up from Tony Burnett.
Yeah.
You're on mute, Tony.
It's catching, the mute's catching. Thanks, Karel. That was a great talk, especially for me who's in front of one of the Cape cohorts tomorrow. We're forming a community practice between Carmarthenshire and Swansea local authorities. I mean, I always ask a similar question to lots of really informative talks. What, I suppose, maybe 1 or 2 key things do you think we should do as an immediate that I can take to this group tomorrow and say, look, you've got to be doing this?
Alliances for change, communities of practice, network the nutters, get them together and try and get top to bottom, and the silos thing ended. I've got to go now. If anybody's interested, Karel, Karel, Karel.williams@manchester.uk will get me. Okay, take care everybody. Enjoy the circular economy projects. Thank you.